PG Sunday Edition.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the KDPG Sunday Edition. I'm Ken Rice. The most high-profile legislative bill of 2020 has come not in Washington, D.C., but in Virginia. Democrats there took control of the legislature this year, elected in part on promises to pass tougher gun laws. But the first major gun reform bill was defeated there this past week. Moderate Democrats joining with Republicans in the Virginia State Senate to kill a bill that would have banned assault-style weapons. That vote came less than a month after a massive gun rights rally in Richmond. Thousands of activists, many of them openly carrying their weapons, descended on the state capitol to protest the bill. And much of the crowd came in from outside Virginia to show their support for Second Amendment rights. It's clear that any effort by state lawmakers to tighten gun laws will draw opposition. And yet, in the most recent Gallup poll, 64% of Americans said the laws governing gun sales should be stricter. So what is a legislator to do? This morning on the KDPG Sunday Edition, we're going to ask one of them. Ed Gainey represents Pittsburgh's East End and Wilkinsburg in the State House, and he was recently named chair of the Anti-Gun Violence Subcommittee of the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus. Representative Gainey, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me today.
So for you, this is more than a political issue, it's a personal issue. Can you tell us about what happened to your sister?
So in 2016, my sister was murdered in Homewood. She was coming out of a bar. The gentleman shot her. It was the first time I've ever seen a body be put in a blue bag. So it was difficult just watching someone that you love be put in a blue bag. It's a lot that goes with it, but it opened my eyes to a lot of different things.
This was a random case? This was a domestic incident? What was the story?
The gentleman made a pass at her. It didn't go well from him. He was high off many different drugs and shot her.
Is he in prison?
Yes.
Did this change the way you view the issue of gun violence and gun possession and who should be allowed to have a gun and who we should work harder to keep guns out of their hands?
I don't know if it changed my view. It's not the first time in the community that I've seen people lose their lives to gun violence. So I'm not going to say it changed my view. What it did was create a greater passion to talk about what we need to do to create and save lives. From that point of view, I've become very active in introducing and supporting many different pieces of legislation. Like I always say, even if we talk about the stolen gun, lost and stolen gun legislation, that is something from Western Pennsylvania I thought that we could all get behind. And the reason being is because most of my gun owners from Western Pennsylvania that are really responsible gun owners, they know where their guns is in the morning before they know where their cereal or money is.
So just to catch everybody up, you're talking about legislation that demands that if your gun is lost or stolen, you need to report that within a certain amount of time.
Exactly, and I don't see no problem with that. Because real gun owners, like I said in the morning, they're going to check their guns every day. We from Western Pennsylvania. They know where their guns is. The only ones that don't know where their guns is the ones that have been unresponsible. And we need to make them responsible, particularly when the gun shows up in a homicide, shows up in a drug deal. We need to ensure when we talk about saving lives that this legislation is passed.
All right, so what do you think? You're trying to get something done about this issue in Pennsylvania. What do you think when you see what happens in Virginia, where there seemed to be a lot of support for toughening the rules on gun ownership, gun sales?
There was a lot of support going into Virginia. We both know that. But we also know that it was an election year and people have to get elected, or they were coming up on an election year. And people have to get elected, and there's a lot of people in the community that don't want to change gun laws. And so a lot of times the representatives or the senators, they have to listen to that, like in the state of PA. They're listening to the constituents back home, so they don't want to move, even if they know it's the right thing to do.
But it's more than the right thing to do. Isn't it what voters tell pollsters they want? So how do you explain that disparity? A majority of Americans tell pollsters, yes, background checks should be tightened up. There should perhaps be restrictions on ownership of certain types of weapons. You're promoting an assault weapons ban. How do you explain that disparity between what Americans tell pollsters and what many in office seem to hear?
Because a lot of times what we told, and we know this, a lot of times what you tell pollsters is not always what you're putting in the community. So you could tell a pollster one thing, but be in the community saying another thing. And so what I've learned in Harrisburg is that all times, the polls are not always accurate. Like, I do believe we have a serious appetite to get universal background checks passed in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The catch is not done, we don't have an appetite. The catch is that there's no will to do it in Harrisburg.
Okay, so if you're saying there's no will to do it and you're somebody fighting for it, could the answer to my question be that even though Americans tell pollsters they want tougher gun laws, they've become used to nothing happening on the issue, so it's not an issue they vote on. They vote on other issues, assuming nothing's going to happen on guns, even though they've expressed their preference that something should happen.
I agree with it. I agree that some things should happen, and I agree that a lot of people feel that something should happen. But I think one of the things that keeps people from voting is their allegiance to certain organizations that they receive some type of campaign finance contribution from. I believe that plays a major part. And so when that happens, sometimes you got to decide who your allegiance is going to be, to the people you represent or to the contributions that you receive. Because there's no question that the NRA plays a major role in talking to legislatures about leaving gun legislation where it's at right now. But what I tell people, when is enough enough? Haven't we seen enough damage to our communities? Let's talk about the children right now that have witnessed. We got more children with PTSD out of school shootings, street shootings, the whole nine. We have an increase in that. Shouldn't we be concerned? Shouldn't we want to do something that's making sure that we make a safe society for the next generation? Because if not, then where will we leading them to?
Okay, so that raises the issue of what's known as a red flag law, where a judge can be given the power through legislation to take away weapons from someone deemed to be a threat to themselves or to others. Where does red flag law legislation stand right now in Harrisburg?
Still talking about it, right? Still going through it. It's like everything else. It's a constant fight. But if we don't fight, if we don't continue to fight, nothing's going to get done. We know it's an uphill battle. But like everything else, things do change. I can't tell you the time and date that it's going to change, but the reality is, as long as you have advocate organizations, legislatures that's going to continue to talk about it, and shootings that's going to continue to happen, I'm not saying that we pass one or two laws, we're going to stop violence, we're going to stop gun violence. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we can put laws in place that will help improve and save people's lives.
And what do you make of the arguments of some of your Republican colleagues who say, we don't need new gun laws, we need to enforce the laws that are already on the books, which is not being done effectively, they would argue, and they would point to the many, many mass shootings where we find out that the killers had purchased their weapons legally?
We're always going to have that conversation. That has nothing to do, things change, times change. When I was a kid, you couldn't get guns like you can get today. There's no question about it. So when you say you just want to enforce the laws that's on the books, that's fine. Let's do that. Let's enforce the laws that we got right now. I'm not against that. What I'm saying is that it's not enough. We have to be able to deal with legislation and pass legislation that deals with the time that we're in right now. No one is saying that we shouldn't look at the books and follow the laws that's on the books. Absolutely, I agree with them. But if everything evolves, why are we not talking about legislation that deals with today's times?
All right, so you are chair of this subcommittee of the Legislative Black Caucus. And one of your proposals is a ban on assault weapons. How do you define assault weapon?
Assault weapons, what I define, and I'm using AR-15. I'm using the one that's been in major killings. I don't believe that you need that on the street. I'm sorry, if you want handguns and all that, I'm fine with. But an AR-15 has done so much damage, whether it's in Pittsburgh, whether it's in Orlando, whether it's in Las Vegas. We know that.
And what is it about an AR-15 that makes it uniquely dangerous?
The mass of people that it can kill in a minute. We've watched it. Everybody's viewed it. At some level, we got to speak about it. You know, hunters, if you're a pure hunter, you don't want an AR-15. You don't want to shoot you don't want an AR-15.
So how is an AR-15 different than a hunting rifle?
Because with a hunting rifle, it's a skill. AR-15, you just blast. And when I talk to some of my hunters, they'll say, listen, that's not what I want. I don't want an AR-15. I want something that demonstrates my skill, and I think it's a skill question.
So you would ban weapons that have pistol grip and the detachable magazines. You can fire more rounds. That's run into opposition. You know, it was the law of the land back in the 1990s, but it's not going anywhere in Washington now. You seem cognizant of the battle, but you're still willing to wage it. Give me a scenario where you could see this being eventually passed and signed into law.
The scenario that I'm going to give you is one I don't want to happen. The more that you have massive killings with AR-15s, the more Americans are going to wake up and ask what we're doing. The more Americans that ask about it, the change is going to come.
We thought it would come after Sandy Hook.
No, not enough.
Thought it would come after Parkland.
Not enough.
Thought it would come after Las Vegas.
Unfortunately, not enough.
Tree of Life.
not enough,
El
unfortunately.
Paso, Dayton.
Yeah, you need it. Unfortunately, it'll be more. It'll be more until people just say we can't afford this no more. In America, when you've had massive change in America, regardless of what era we've been in, it's because the people said we've had enough. But there's a lot of things that had to happen before that change took place. We understand the pattern. History always comes back as a good teacher. We understand that this is not going to be done overnight. But we know, unfortunately, the more it happens, the more it creates a national panic that we have to do something. And I think you're seeing it. There is an increase because, like you said, there's an appetite now for universal background checks. 10 years ago, there wasn't an appetite. So we know that only through time and our advocacy can we get this to be.
There's no background check in Pennsylvania required right now, if I understand correctly, for the sale of a long gun,
Right.
A private sale. So if a private seller wants to sell you a handgun, there would have to be a background check. But on long gun, that's something you'd want to close up.
Absolutely. And there's no reason why. If it's on handguns, why not long guns?
All right, we're down to just a couple of minutes. I want to get your reaction to something that's been in the news this past week. Allegheny County Common Pleas Judge Mark Tranquilli has been removed from hearing cases assigned to administrative duties because of allegedly racist remarks that he made about a female juror. Where does the Legislative Black Caucus stand on this? What's your personal stance on whether he should continue to be a judge?
So I'm not going to talk from the Black Caucus stand. I think they made a comment themselves. I think the comment that we put out was strong. But if we really want to talk about it, if you want me to believe that justice is blind, then you have to be able to rule in that manner. And whenever you call somebody an Aunt Jemima, I have no confidence in the face of justice and going into his courtroom and believing I'm going to get a fair trial. And I think that a lot of people feel that way, particularly when you look at the way the penitentiary is set up. I think now is a great opportunity for us to say that we need to change that. There's no reason, there's no one that's going to walk in our courtroom that's African American and feel they're going to get a fair trial. That doesn't exist anymore. And I think as leaders of this region, we need to speak up on it. We need to talk about that this is not the level of justice that we want on the bench. Because if you cannot render a fair trial, no need to be on the bench. And no one's going to walk in that courtroom of color and feel that they're going to get a fair trial. At some level, I want to thank him, Justice Clark, because I think her moving him to traffic division, that's great. But at the end of the day, it's not enough. We need to send a vision that this type of racism is not going to be tolerated. And there's only one way to do it.
I know that our station has reached out to get is there a side of the story he wants to get some comment from him? Do you know if there's been any outreach on the part of the judge to you or anyone else in public office?
No.
Not aware of anything?
No. But at the end of the day, the statement is the statement. There's covert and there's overt. And we know that that was a definite racist comment to be able to make, calling someone an Aunt Jemima. And then you want us to go in front of your courtroom and feel comfortable that we can get a fair trial. No one believes that. And something has to be done if you want people to believe that justice is blind and it's going to be on the render of the case and not the color. Right now, he demonstrated that when you walk in that courtroom, color plays a part.
We're out of time. State Representative Ed Gainey, thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
We'll take a break. When we come back, fighting hate and prejudice at a young age, the program going into more schools in the Pittsburgh area when the KDPG Sunday Edition continues.